100, 200 emails, that would be quite a lot to wade through. That would seem like that would be quite a high response rate. So all you'd need is for there to be 200 people in the country who were willing to say they believed in homeopathy, and we know there's far more than 200 people willing to do that. The real issue has been that in those consultations, the skeptical voice has been missing because we as a movement, we as an activist force, haven't necessarily been engaged in those kind of things, largely because we're amateurs by and large, which is not a slight on skeptics. It's just the nature of skepticism often is a hobby. There are very few people who are in a position where they can make skepticism something they spend a large amount of time on, because we all have full-time jobs. I'm fortunate that I actually work for a skeptical charity and actually can be in those kind of places. So because people aren't professionally involved in advocating skepticism, we don't necessarily, or in the past, we haven't necessarily known that these conversations were going on or how to get involved in them. So what we've maybe found is that, when the Wirral NHS in 2010 came out and said, we're going to have a consultation because we want to get rid of homeopathy, you can get an awful lot of skeptics going, brilliant, I agree that homeopathy should be finished. I'm glad the Wirral's making this move. And that's as far as they'd go. Maybe they'd put up on Facebook or Twitter or talk to their friends about it, but that's as far as they'd go. Whereas the homeopaths, would pass a message to the British Homeopathic Association, who'd get in touch with the Faculty of Homeopathy and the Society of Homeopathy, who'd then send messages to all their members saying, this particular part of the NHS is going to get rid of homeopathy. We think this isn't, we want you to write to them and tell them why they shouldn't. So while skeptics might be patting the NHS on the back for making a good decision, the homeopaths are out there arguing against it, and largely because they fundamentally believe in homeopathy. I don't think they're perpetrating a con. I think they're just they're very passionately involved in something where they just happen to have the wrong answer. I don't think they're evil people by any stretch of imagination. Largely, I'd say they're very well-meaning.
Yeah, I mean, in my younger days, I used to be an activist regarding certain things, political things. And then, you kind of get the idea that the guy on the other side's got, a tail and devil horns and stuff. And then you meet them and you realize, no, he's just got a very different idea from you. Even if you're still strongly, strongly opposed to their ideas, you have to sort of keep in mind that the other person on the other side is human as well.
I think that's always true of all skeptical issues. I've been involved in active skepticism from a hobbyist point of view and then a professional point of view for about 7 years, maybe 8 years, something like that now. And I have to admit, the number of people I've met who I would, if you put a gun to my head and force me to put my nickel down, that I would say that person is an active con artist, is incredibly small. I mean, the majority of people whose ideas we're opposed to as skeptics, I think, they want to be good people. They have good intentions. They want to help. They want to be in a position to make things better for people. They just have the wrong answer. So it's writing them off and dehumanizing them. You actually miss an awful lot of what's really going on there, and you start fighting a straw man. And I think that's kind of what was happening in these kind of conversations. And it happens just as much the other way, is that the homeopaths who turn up to these consultations will say that any skeptic who's in that room and says, I'm a skeptic, I don't think homeopathy should be funded, that's immediately because you're paid for by the pharmaceutical companies and you've got a financial interest in this and you've been put up to it, because they can't accept that we just have a different outlook on this, a different perspective on this. What they think is evidence, the idea that they took homeopathy and then they got better, largely is what you'll find. We have a different standard of evidence. I always try and point out to people that you might have once taken homeopathy and felt much better because of it, and that might convince you that homeopathy works. But we need to be much more open-minded and look at not just a single case, but hundreds of cases, thousands of cases. And we've got to be as open-minded as we can by taking as much bias out as we can. And once you do that, you've just described a clinical trial. It's not science, it's not witchcraft, rather. It's not magic. It's just a simple logic of what's the best way to get to the right answer. And it isn't to listen to this one particular example, but to try and take 1,000 different examples in the same kind of way and take as much kind of bias and random chance and probability and placebo and all these other kind of biases out of it, so that we get as close to the right answer as possible. And that's the standard of evidence that we seek. So I think that's where we really disagree. But it means that when these consultations were happening and these conversations were happening, skeptics were absent from it because we simply didn't know it was there. We didn't know these kind of things were happening, which means the administrators and the clinicians and the clinical bodies inevitably only ever hear from the people who disagree with the idea of getting rid of homeopathy, and that's very difficult for them to then go ahead and stop funding homeopathy, because as far as they can tell, everybody who got in touch about it basically thinks they should carry on funding it. So it's really important that skeptics are looking out for these kind of issues now, and they're able to be engaged in those conversations, and also engage in those conversations in a rational, reasonable, polite, friendly way, so that we don't look like we're the sat in the corner of the room with sulfur vapors rising off us and the smell of fire and brimstone because we're the devil. We just need to be the nice guy in the room who happens to have a different opinion, but who the reasonable people who are there can recognise that we just disagree.
And this is a thing I wanted to throw at you a bit, because some of my friends are doctors on the NHS. And, you've described what homeopathy is, which is essentially water. So, in essence, there could be no harm from it. And that's what my friends that are NH doctors might say, that, well, there's no harm in it as long as they keep taking the normal medicine. But that's the important part, as long as they keep taking the normal medicine. Because I've read many stories where people have taken homeopathic cures instead of chemotherapy. And recently, I've also been reading some stories about, there was an analysis on some homeopathic medicine, inverted commas, water, but actually had some kind of poisonous things in it as well, because they hadn't been cleaning the thing well or not. So, I mean, do you think there are actually, aside from people paying money for something that is essentially water, do you think there are actual dangers involved in homeopathy?
Oh yes, yeah, I absolutely do, and I think there are several different types of dangers. I mean, for one, I don't think doctors should be in a position where they are prescribing or handing out treatments that they know don't work, and that's where we are with homeopathy. We know these things do not work. It would take a monumental amount of evidence to overturn all the evidence we've had so far that says a homeopathy is nothing but placebo. So it's kind of an old-fashioned view of medicine to say that I'm the doctor, I know best, I know this doesn't work, but I think you need to be effectively lied to in order to feel better. And that's kind of what you're doing. And you can get at these kind of conversations about the ethics of prescribing placebos. But we as skeptics, I think, can make a mistake or a misstep in our rationalizing. And whenever I give talks about homeopathy, this question always comes up. If it's a placebo effect, is that so bad? Shouldn't we harness the placebo effect? It's just a sugar pill. And for that, I'd always kind of say that we know that homeopathy is just a placebo. That doesn't mean that a placebo equals homeopathy. If you want to get in a conversation about should we be able to give out placebos on the NHS, we can do anything we want as a placebo. I mean, we're imaginative creatures. Make up a placebo, but try not to come up with a placebo that's got or trying to rest on a placebo that's got 2 centuries of the guy at the end of the street saying this will cure what ails you. Because that guy at the end of the street isn't thinking this is just a placebo. They really do think this can cure cancer. I mean, I was in a NHS consultation in December in Liverpool, and there were 30 or so people in the room. 27 of them were there to say homeopathy is fantastic and wonderful. Several of them were working for the homeopathy service who had the contract. But of the people who were there because they'd gone along, 5 or 6 different people stood up and said, we should keep homeopathy on the NHS because I use homeopathy to cure cancer. I give out homeopathic sugar pills, or I took homeopathic pills to cure my cancer, and now I'm cancer-free. And what's almost certainly the case, I mean, obviously you don't know their case history, is that often when people make those claims and are still alive, they either were getting conventional medicine along with taking homeopathy, or they were one of the very fortunate cases who had a spontaneous remission and attribute that to homeopathy, or they're still in remission now, or there's always some kind of intricacy thing there. But what you don't hear from is the people who took homeopathy for their cancer and died as a result of it, because they aren't in that room. They can't say those things. And sadly, working for a skeptical charity, we do hear from people from time to time who've lost family members to cancers that are deemed very treatable by their oncologists. Their oncologists will give a very high percentage chance of a 10-year survival, like a 90% plus chance of 10-year survival. But they turn down all conventional treatment and turn to homeopathy and then several other different types of alternative medicine too, and die within years, within 2 or 3 years. And those cases are utterly tragic. There's a huge harm there. And there's other harms on top of that too, I think. And I recognise that on the NHS, people aren't going to be getting homeopathy for cancer. That's not how that works. But my fear, my worry, is that if you're giving the message that homeopathy works, That's what people hear. They don't hear it works for things that are going to get better anyway because we know it's just a placebo. They hear homeopathy works. If you're going to the NHS for a homeopathic migraine consultation and then your migraine goes away because they tend to go away, and then your migraine comes back because for some people they come back, do you really want to have to go back to the doctor to get referred to the homeopath and wait a week or so to get your appointment? Or do you say, well, actually, the last time I had a migraine, they sent me for homeopathy. There's a homeopath on the high street. I'll pop in and see them instead. I won't bother the NHS with this. And then before you know it, you mention that you've just had a baby, and the homeopath mentions you shouldn't vaccinate your kids because they're quite often anti-vaccination in their views. And the NHS is essentially acting as a pathway into quackery, a pathway into quite dangerous claims, and legitimising those dangerous claims on the way. So I think we do see quite a lot of harm from homeopathy, and it's this kind of secondary backdoor harm of people who believe that it's going to work and don't take it just for placebo benefit for self-limiting conditions. They take it for things that are really serious. I mean, I've been sold homeopathic anti-malarial pills.
Oh, wow. Well, it's interesting you said that. You mentioned quinine right at the start. That is used as a malarial drug, but actually has some quite awful side effects sometimes. Some people that take it tend to have a very bad reaction to it. Some people are totally fine, other people have a very bad reaction, just as an aside there. But when you were saying there was statistics, are there any statistics for people who take the normal medicine or the conventional medicine along with homeopathy, and those that take homeopathic medicine and exclude the normal therapy? Are there any statistics for that?
Well, there is for the first one of those. So I think there was a study done, and I don't actually know the details, but it's something that if listeners are interested, they could I'm sure they could find it. There was a study done during the 2010 report by the Science and Technology Committee, the Science and Technology Select Committee, rather, by the government, and they took a look at homeopathy in their Evidence Check 2, it was called, and one of the studies in there actually looked at whether conventional medicine, it compared conventional medicine to conventional medicine plus homeopathy, to see whether homeopathy did have this additional benefit. And they concluded at the end of it that it's not worth it even in that circumstances. And I can kind of understand why, especially when you do consider that you're putting the reputation of the NHS to you're lending that name and that credibility to something that simply doesn't work. I can understand exactly why. In terms of statistics around people who reject conventional medicine for homeopathy, it's very hard to get to that, because ultimately they've rejected conventional medicine, and conventional medicine is the area that they're most likely to be monitored in. That's the thing about a systemized approach to medicine, an actual professional convention of medicine, is that you have all these checks and balances and reporting and things like that. Whereas when it comes to homeopathy, you don't need any of that auditing, any of that oversight. You and I could set up as a homeopath tomorrow. We could set our own homeopathy clinic up tomorrow if we wanted, with the level of training that we've cumulatively got between us. It isn't something where you need to have done huge amounts of education and then sign up to a professional membership body and then submit audits and be regulated and all this kind of stuff. I mean, those things do exist, but they're voluntary. So anybody could set up as a homeopathy clinic. Anybody could buy homeopathy online. I mean, I actually, one of the things I did working for the Good Thinking Society last year was buy homeopathic remedies from fairly big retailers online that were unlicensed and were effectively unlicensed medicines. This isn't breaking the law in selling me this. And people like Tesco were willing to sell me a homeopathic remedy that has no license for sale in the UK. This should be a major scandal that these are unlicensed medicines being sold by major manufacturers, and Nelson's, who supply all of Boots homeopathy and supply parts of the NHS, were selling unlicensed remedies, and other people too. Freeman's Homeopathics up in Glasgow, who supply all the homeopathic remedies to the Glasgow Homeopathic Hospital, or what it's now called. They were selling unlicensed remedies. If this was anything other than sugar pills in a bottle, this would be a major scandal. But the very fact that these are all indistinguishable sugar pills, people can take this in a much more sort of casual way, and the regulators don't necessarily take it too seriously and think this is an important breach. But ultimately, the signal that it's sending, the message it's sending people, is that this stuff works, and it's a terrible message to sell when you can buy online homeopathic diabetes medicine, as I bought last year.
Oh. Is there a lot of money in the industry?
Hard to say. I mean, again, it's very difficult to get a good dollar amount on it because anybody could set up as a homeopath, and they don't have these kind of regulations, so they don't have an auditing kind of thing. I know that there was an estimate for how big the industry was worth in terms of Germany and France, and I think it was something like 300 million euros in each of those. But I'm relatively fuzzy on it. I don't actually think it's huge. I don't think people get into homeopathy as a get-rich-quick scheme. I don't think they do it for the cash. I think they do it because they fundamentally believe that it works and they fundamentally want to help. They're just wrong. They've got the wrong answers, unfortunately. There are probably better ways